This is the Art and Design Our Labor panel. And before we begin, I just wanted to really thank Kyung-hee and also Dan and all the people that they've pulled together at F.I.T. for this grant project that combines both the practical and the material along with the creative, the deeply theoretical with the political and the economic. I have learned so much, particularly about pedagogical methods from both of you and the people you've brought together, and I'm really appreciative of that. My name is Carol Quirke. I teach at SUNY-Old Westbury in the American Studies Department, and I write about photography and social movements, particularly photography in mid-century and post-war America. And I'm really happy to introduce to you three really amazing panelists, all connected to F.I.T. in different ways. I'm going to begin with Ruben Marroquin, who is a recent graduate of F.I.T. in the Textile Surface Design program. His artistic education began at the Armando Reverón University of Caracas in Venezuela. He now teaches weaving also at F.I.T. He opened a textile studio recently in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he creates his fiber sculptures and also holds workshops. The fiber work that he creates is right behind him. It is stunning. It kind of reminded me of Lee Bontekoe, but a little bit lighter and a little bit happier. Is created by hand weaving fibers over fibers and applying them onto handmade frames. His technique utilizes embroidery and metallic yarns, metal fibers, silk, linen, hand materials such as bottles, bamboo, and other objects. His work has been shown at international exhibitions, and he has collaborated with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and their educational programs as they relate to weaving and the fiber arts. He's enjoyed collaborations with interior designers, most recently with Kelly Wiersler, and he is represented by Tierra Mar Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Natasha Degen is a professor and chair of art market studies at F.I.T. She earned her AB from Princeton University and an MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she studied as a Gates Scholar. She's a recognized writer and critic, having contributed to publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Financial Times, Art Forum, and Frieze. And she's also a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Art Market Studies. Among other prizes, she received a $30,000 Art Criticism Award from the Andy Warhol Foundation, and also a Luce Scholarship, which sent her to Beijing for a year, which sounds wonderful. She edited The Market by MIT Press in 2013, which is an interdisciplinary anthology tracing the art market's interaction with contemporary practice. And thirdly, we have Natalie Nudell, who is a fashion and textile historian and who teaches in the art history department or history of art department at F.I.T. She is the producer and writer of the documentary Calendar Girl, which came out in 2020 about Ruth Finley, and the fashion calendar, which will be showing at the Miami Jewish Film Festival from April 15th through the 29th. Her research on the fashion calendar and the American fashion industry, Ruth Finley's Fashion Calendar, was published in the Hidden History of American Fashion, edited by Nancy Dale. Along with other scholarly and popular publications, Nudell's an associate editor of the Fashion Studies Journal, and she is one of the founders of the Fashion Studies Alliance. So with that, why don't we begin with some of the questions? And Natalie, you'll just let me know if you're ready for me to pull up the slides. So the first question that I have for the three of you is that in your specific fields, and your fields are actually broad, it seems to me, they're more than actually what I listed, so feel free to add from whatever angle makes sense to you, but clearly textile design, interior design, being a critic, being a gallerist, being attentive to art markets, fashion design, fashion shows. So in your fields, what do you identify as some of the most critical transitions or shifting dynamics in the last 50 years and how the work of your field gets done? And I didn't ask anyone to go first, so.
Well, I'm happy to start us off. I guess I'll define my field as the business of art. As you mentioned, I run a Master's of Arts program here at F.I.T. that focuses on the art market. So thinking about this, I would point to 4 major developments, maybe, particularly since the 1990s. Which I kind of see as operating in pairs. So first, I would cite globalization, which has required a much more international perspective, but also a more networked approach. And I think, coinciding with that was the rise of the internet and the rise of online technologies, which has also led to a much faster paced, more 24/7 business environment. And then in addition to that, I would also cite the kind of professionalization of the field. Things that had been very informal, that were just based on personal relationships, have become codified and governed by contracts. And then along with that, I would also point to the corporatization of the art world, meaning both the adoption of corporate practices, but also the sort of consolidation of market share in the hands of a few elite players. So, the name brands of the art world like Christie's and Sotheby's and Gagosian and David Werner and Hauser and Wirth and players like that. So I think we are seeing a vastly, vastly different environment from 50 years prior. And I think even though my area is really on the art market, I think a lot about artistic production and what it means to work as an artist. And I think a lot of these trends have really impacted artistic labor as well. So maybe that's something we can touch on later.
Natalie or Ruben, are you interested in taking up that question?
I'm sorry, Carol, would you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. I saw you come back, but I didn't see when you left. I'm sorry. No, I was just curious, in your specific field, what do you identify as some of the major trends in the last 50 years that have really perhaps changed the work or the market or the production of the kind of work that you do?
Yes, I've seen a lot of different trends, especially in the world of painting, which is a world that I'm really passionate about. I've seen a lot of light, play with light in painting. A lot of the return of humanism, for example, the human figure as opposed to, but also abstract. But there's been a big, a lot of figurative art out there in the galleries. A lot of it, deals with contemporary issues that we face today. Black artists, for example, have shown some of the most interesting examples of strong and powerful art. I've seen also works that show gender and gay life in New York, for example, and beyond. And then politics, many aspects commenting on, for example, Fox News or the media and how it affects the way of thinking of Americans and the world. So I've seen a lot of that type of engagement with society. And personally, it does affect me profoundly. I think in terms of my art, it hasn't really changed that much. It's kept it's sort of my own investigation. But at the same time, I do think a lot about how I could perhaps join the conversation and how in some ways my work actually also engages in some of these, in the politics of art, but perhaps in ways that I haven't really figured out yet.
Your answer is really fascinating because it's almost like an aesthetic response to what Natalie said about trends within the art market, a counter response in effect. that Natasha said, excuse me. Natalie, did you want to add anything on that first question?
No, well, as you all know from my bio, I'm not really an artist or a maker, but I teach artists and makers. And so I think that I think I'll have a lot more to add to the following question.
Okay, great. I mean, it struck me that what Natasha described was totally true for the fashion industry as well.
Well, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no, because I also think that with the corporatization of the fashion industry, it also created these like cracks where you have a lot more individualized participation and ability, especially through social media and other, you know, platforms for individuals to sort of subvert this traditional system that was very, you know, solidly in place for many years. So, you know, we'll see what's happening, and, you know, COVID-19 is also dismantling that heavily. But labor and fashion is so intertwined, and always.
Yeah, I would second that too. I mean, I did point specifically to corporatization and to the consolidation of a lot of market share in the hands of, you know, a few larger players. But I do also think that right now the art market is definitely in a state of flux, and we're seeing some alternatives emerge in terms of labor practices, alternatives in terms of making a living through artistic work, artistic labor. And that's something I hope we can touch on later as well, because that's, I think, a really interesting development, especially in terms of pedagogy and how we introduce students to all of the options that might be available to them.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really fascinating. I hope that we get to take that up again because that seems very interesting to me. Okay, well, why don't we move on to the second question then, which is, as an artist or a designer or someone who studies and teaches about these things, what do you believe students should know about the business and labor of the art and design fields? Or what do you think new professionals should know? Because you're teaching students who are going on to work in these areas. So what do you think when they walk out the door that they need to know? Natalie, do you want to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in here. You know, as I was saying, although I study the fashion industry, the vast majority of my students are learning to hopefully enter the fashion industry or other sort of design industries. And I think that being at F.I.T in particular, and the freedom of New York, and sort of how design education is done today, is sort of misleading in terms to students in sort of understanding how people with these skills in the past would have had to grapple with how they learn their skills, how their skills were regulated, etc. And so if you could pull up my first slide, I think that it illuminates really well, and I'll be very quick, about how in my classes I sort of use ideas about, I use paintings that depict fashion to sort of tell and break apart questions of labor, and like who's making the clothing, why are they making the clothing, and how does it operate within the fashion. So on the left we see a portrait of Beatrice D'Este from the Lombard School. It is a very interesting portrait, and it's very well broken down in a text by Carol Collier Frick called Gendered Space in Renaissance Florence. And she speaks about how in the 15th century, from the early period until the end of it, you see the formalization of a once much more sort of independent garment labor scenario where men and women, dressmakers and tailors, were beginning to professionalize. But as the guilds start to solidify and really become these institutions, they completely push out women. And women are not allowed to join the guilds, although they had traditionally already been participating in these garment cultures and fashion cultures and in the production of these things. And what's interesting about this portrait is that in order to really break down what the fashion is, it sort of transcends all these different guilds, right? There are many different guilds. Each guild is responsible for one thing: silks, you know, ribbons, jewelry, lace, shirting, etc. But to create a fashionable garment, you need all of these together. And so many of these women who had previously been actively involved in the textile or garment industries and who have now been marginalized because they've been pushed out of guild membership eligibility, essentially find their role as these makers of fashionability. And so they help these women of these elite families in Italy, particularly in Florence and in the north, represent fashionability and the status of their family. And these headpieces that we see and the sort of details and accessories of fashion were, and we know for a fact, made and facilitated by these women workers because their names were in ledgers and accounts of all of these families that, and many of them were known by names. And so I think that in my context, thinking about this question, when I turn to the next painting in this slide, you see Giovanni Battista Moroni's The Tailor. One of the big questions about this painting is who is this person? Because in this period, only master tailors could actually cut fabric without the supervision of their customer. And so again, the regulations, how the sharing and sort of spread of this knowledge was regulated and controlled and gendered and how it interacts with fashion. I think when I teach this to my students, they're often shocked. This is an experience that they personally really, it takes a while for them to grapple with. But I think this idea of the regulation of this craft knowledge and sort of the practice of making things for a very long period of time was very regulated. And I think it's very useful for students to learn about it.
Great. You don't want to look at the other slides now? You want to hold off?
Yeah, I think it'll be better for maybe like the last question.
Great. Okay, thanks. Natasha and Ruben, what do you think about this question? What you think new professionals, what your students should know, what they should know as they enter into their new professions, and what can be taught in the classroom about the history of the labor history and the business history of fashion and design and art.
Ruben, or I'm happy to jump in as well.
Yes, go ahead, Natalie.
Well, our program has a very professional focus in a way, and I would say we do balance that with history and theory. And I know you have a question coming up about curriculum and about courses that we teach that touch specifically on that, and I can speak to that more specifically. I teach a course, for instance, on the history of the art market, which I think is very much in line with what this conference is about and these questions. But I did want to say that, even though I'm not an artist or a maker myself, we have a lot of students who come to our program with undergraduate backgrounds, either in art history or in fine arts. And I'm always intrigued to find out, what they learned about this sort of professional setting, how they learned, if at all, to navigate their careers in a BFA program, or we've even had students that have MFAs. And it is remarkable how little I think programs often do impart to students, in terms of their either professional knowledge, the professional options that are available to them. So maybe I'll answer this question a little bit differently and talk to that, because I think that this is something that is really actually quite important. And it's a tricky thing because, I think there is often this sort of church and state separation between artistic practice and the sort of professional side or the business side or the sort of labor side of things. But, increasingly, I think as we see greater professionalization in the art field, and maybe even particularly the range of options that are available to students really proliferate, I think that the onus is on the institution to provide some context for students. And I think often students are somewhat lost exiting studio programs. I think it's understandable, especially because professors often have, I mean, they have academic positions, right? So they're people that have come through a particular system, and that's what they would know. And I've heard from students about, you know, professors either encouraging them to enter academia or telling them about the gallery model, or having a class that helps them prepare portfolios, but in a very like old school, maybe even outdated way, like preparing slides to go to Chelsea or something, which is not what anyone should do at this point. So, you know, I think that there's a lot that can and probably should be done in this space. I would point to a few things that I would recommend. You know, I think having an understanding of contracts, so basic art law, finance and accounting, but also an understanding of how the art market works on a very kind of basic level, like who the players are, how their business models work, how they make money, you know, what is a typical split between a gallery and an artist, those types of very pragmatic things, but also an awareness of the alternative paths that exist for people who don't want to go that route, whether that be, you know, freelance work. We see, you know, even now, like Hollywood agencies opening fine arts divisions to accommodate the number of, you know, kind of corporate commissions and collaborations that have taken off in recent years. So I think there's a lot more options, including artists who bypass the traditional gallery system and sell their work through social media, through Instagram, through other means. So I think that, you know, it is important to discuss these things, to give students a sense of what their expectations should be, but also to discuss the potential pitfalls, because a lot of these labor practices do have an exploitative side. So those are the things I would love to see, you know, students who are studying art specifically to learn.
That's great. That's really specific. Ruben, do you want to speak to this as well? Especially since you're a recent graduate, although it sounds like you've gone back and forth, you know, working outside the university setting.
Yes, I worked as a weaver in a company in Brooklyn, and I specialized in weaving at F.I.T. So I had the chance to experience what it is to weave all day long, and you know, maybe not get paid so much either. So even though I was getting paid well, being in New York, you know, it just doesn't matter how much you get paid. It's never enough to pay rent and to pay everything that you need to take care of. So it was tough. I remember I just thought about a book that I read about, that I shared with my boss at the time, and I didn't realize that as I was giving her the book, it was perhaps a protest or a complaint, or you know, sort of cry for help, because these weavers in Germany, you know, they were struggling, they were getting paid so little, and at the same time working so hard. And then they rebel against the boss, and you know, they take over their house and stuff and burn it. But what's and what's important is that, you know, it's just a tough work. You know, it's not easy to weave, and the design part is beautiful and the result is beautiful, but what goes into it is super difficult. You're breathing fibers all day, your back hurts, you know, every part of your body hurts, and then it's so monotonous. You know, you're just going and going and going, and it's just like the yards never cease to need to get woven. But you know, I think what I would tell students is, you know, get prepared to work hard. I think FIT is great at teaching the value of hard work. It's great at you know, giving you a lot of homework to do. So it's in a way you have to learn to multitask. For example, I'm great at focusing on one single thing for many hours, and FIT taught me that that's not always the best way to approach things. Sometimes you have to be able to just detach from the detail and from the perfection of the artwork, and see it more as simply an exercise, and just get the art out of the way quickly without obsessing too much over the quality of the art, and just focus more on the exercise itself. For example, on the computer program that you're trying to learn, or on simply what is required to get the grade, as opposed to spending hours and hours, which becomes sometimes a block of sorts. A lot of students and myself, especially, I'll spend so many hours on the art and then forget that the class is not an art class, it's a computer program class. So even before I scan the art onto the computer, I've spent half of the semester. And in a way, also, it's a way to avoid what you have to do, which is learn the computer program that is challenging and is that perhaps not user-friendly. So F.I.T. Is great at that. I think it's really good at just teaching you the value of hard work. And also, they have rules that perhaps in other universities are not enforced so much, like, for example, class attendance, being on time for class, and being prepared for class, which I know in other countries that I've had a chance, attendance is not necessarily that important, nor punctuality. But at F.I.T, those things are taken very seriously. And I think it's a great lesson on the professional world, what you will encounter when you get a job. You can't be late. 5 minutes late is not fashionably late. You should be 5 minutes early for work. And you should be also prepared for work. And you should show up for work. So those things are super important. So what I always tell people, what did I learn at F.I.T? Well, I learned how to survive in New York City. Because if you follow those rules, you will always have a job. Something I also learned through working and through working with very successful people in the city is something that struck me at first as something unhealthy, like being obsessed with work and constantly working and not being able to rest a minute of the day because you're always thinking about, when you're not working, you're thinking, you're texting, you're always networking. And to me, that was a little bit odd at the beginning. But then I realized that sometimes it's the only way to be successful. You have to really sacrifice a lot of things and strategize. So every hour of the day, it's getting you closer to accomplish your goal, especially if you can do it. If you have, other responsibilities, it's understandable that you have to take care of family and friends and other things. But if you're able to have the free time, you really have to, as a student, and this is from a personal experience, to just be able to dedicate every minute or every hour to achieving your goal. For example, if you want to enjoy yourself, well, maybe enjoy yourself by going to the Metropolitan Museum instead of doing something else that has nothing to do with art. And also try to get a job in the arts so that you learn a lot of, more about the business that you're involved in. For example, networking with people. I always, something that has always surprised me, and it's really nice, is to reach out to people you admire and telling them how much you like their work. And surprisingly enough, oftentimes you'll get a response. So, and sometimes those folks are willing to meet up and have, in my case, sometimes become mentors and friends. Oh, sorry, Carol, I think you're muted. Yes.
I assume that's something that's not on the curriculum at F.I.T, though I could be wrong, because that seems particularly challenging. Ruben, I'm curious how your boss took it when you handed them this book. It sounds like a wonderful book.
I don't think it was ever read, but another lesson that I also tell everybody is never talk ill about your employers or ex-employers, because it just reflects how you will be talking about your present employers. So it's super important never to throw anyone under the bus. And like I said, I was getting paid really well. It's just that New York City is extremely expensive. And my boss was wonderful, but I was also my boss's first full-time employee, and my boss was my first full-time boss. So I think it was a learning curve for both of us.
Maybe we should move on to the third question then. And I'm going to slightly change the order of this, but I'm curious, and I think each of you will answer this differently. You know, Natasha, you're leading a program, so there's lots of different courses that relate to this. You know, Ruben, this might just relate to your work or to the class that you teach at F.I.T. But in what ways do you explore how business shapes the art and design in your courses? Do you approach what it means to be a worker in these fields? And then do you look at the broader trends in global capitalism and how it affects the work that you or your students will be doing?
I'm happy to jump in here. I teach history of Western costume, history of textile design, history of 20th century textile design. And I think sort of even more than art, fashion is always necessarily a commercial and laborious um, industry or practice or culture in general. And I think in my classes, I talk about labor and the workers and who is making the garments um, all the time. And to me, it's a very important counterpoint because as much as we're looking at the garments and we're looking at paintings, we're looking at representation of bodies and all of these broader ideas, it's very important for me to always think about whose hands are making these things and whose bodies are they being worn on. And in my, if you don't mind, Carol, if you could put up my second slide. I speak a lot about not only labor and labor practices, but how war and economy and all kinds of different larger historical events influence the movement of labor, the movement of skill, the transferal of different technologies throughout time, etc. But I think for my history of textile class, both the larger survey and the 20th century survey, I think, you know, I speak about labor all the time. I speak about capitalism, we speak about the Industrial Revolution, we speak about Karl Marx, we speak about all of these ideas. But I think this semester I had a very interesting experience that I think I could give as an example. I always speak about William Morris, the well-known, you know, textile and surface designer and, you know, vehement design reformer. And within art history and, you know, generally design studies, William Morris is really this sort of like mythologized figure, right? Very sort of always thinking about the labor, always thinking about the worker, trying to radically transform and react to the Industrial Revolution, which we know completely was very, very impactful in sort of stymieing this transferal of craft knowledge because of the sort of increased access and speed of which industrialization and mechanization grew. But this semester, I actually assigned William Morris's text, 1892 text, How I Became a Socialist. Previously, I was really more focused on like the design and all these things that they were doing with dyes and practices and Merton Abbey and the guilds and all these things. But I thought, especially in the times we're living in, when the word socialist is thrown out to like any person who thinks free healthcare is a thing, that it's very important to really articulate like what is socialism in this time. And so we see here on the left, you know, one of William Morris's or Morris & Co.'s designs, and in the center, there's a header image for The Chance of Socialism, which was a socialist text. This one was actually designed by Morris himself. On the top left corner, it says agitate, which is my favorite socialist word. But what I found really interesting about it's oh, you can't see my mouse, but it's right over the Socialist League on the top left. There's like someone carrying something that says agitate. But I think what was really interesting is that the newly released version of the How I Became a Socialist has an introduction that gives a little background on William Morris. And after my students read it, I thought it created a really interesting conversation because the conversation pushed back at William Morris. Although we talked about socialism and how socialism, you know, this idealistic socialism that William Morris puts forth as the sort of foundation for his design reform movement, is that a lot of my students were saying is that ultimately it's very much steeped in privilege. William Morris was himself a son of a very wealthy merchant. He was highly educated at Oxford. He was best friends with the, the Pre-Raphaelites. He had a very sort of an experience very much not that of the laborer and not that of the factory worker, although he had all of these ideas about how the worker and the craftsman ought to be living and ought to be working. And I think that within the academy, or at least within my work, we fall back on these tropes of being like, oh, look at this amazing artist. He was so, committed to the craftsperson. But it was really my students who brought up that they complicated this story a little bit more. And so I think when you really think about labor and the making of these things and how labor often and labor movements are reactions, right, to these larger historical events like industrialization, thinking about what part of the labor is calling for these things, how labor in and of itself is not just a monolith, right? There are many different types of labor, levels of labor, and even within labor movements, there are their own issues. So I think this is something that I very much bring into my curriculum and I think is really important to communicate to students.
I'll jump in as well and just say, the program that I run, which is our market studies, is, so much about this question about how business shapes the art and design fields. It's really at the core of what we do. And so it sort of runs through all of our coursework. And our coursework ranges from classes that are more, as I mentioned before, either historical or theoretical, but then we also have courses that look more specifically at the main business models of the art world, like the gallery, the auction house, and are like slightly more pragmatic or professionally oriented. But I think this question, again, cuts through everything that we do. And, also the idea of what it means to be a worker, quote unquote, in these fields, an art worker. But I also wanted to just follow up on something that Natalie said about, how because fashion is always commercial, that sort of informs her teaching. And, I think this is, again, an interesting question because so many of our students come from either art history or fine arts background, most of whom did not go to F.I.T. It sounds like F.I.T. does offer a lot of coursework that is informed by the social, the historical, these kind of labor questions. But, instead, a lot of students have encountered art history or studio art and the idea of art as really this decontextualized object. And so, I think a lot of what we do is to sort of fill in the gaps in a way, or to address or to really sort of change students' perspective and to really see art as something that's not sort of isolated from social or economic conditions, but related to broader economic trends, whether those be the rise of global capitalism or in our historical classes, we'll look even sort of in earlier periods and talk about the relationship between art and economics. And so I think that, this is like very much what our bread and butter, what we do. But, it is interesting because even what you were saying, Natalie, about like teaching the same course or teaching the same material, teaching the arts and crafts movement, you could teach that just through objects. You can really isolate textile design, or you could teach it in a very, very different way. And I think that's ultimately like what this conference is about, talking about the possibilities for opening things up and bringing in histories that our students, especially art and design students, don't often get in their coursework.
Great. Ruben, do you want to take a crack at this question of how business shapes the curriculum perhaps that you teach, or how you think it should?
Yes, for me, it's directly transition between my what I studied, which is in the School of Art and Design. I studied textile design, but now I work in the School of Business and Technology in TDM, so textile marketing, textile development and marketing. So it's very different because it's more oriented towards the business side, and I always tend to push a little bit more towards the artistic side because that's my background. And I believe that one shouldn't exclude the other. For example, we tend to think that work that is done on the computer is perhaps more on the business side, whereas work that is done on a sheet of paper is more on the art side. And I find that, for example, if I go shopping for clothes, I find that this is visible in the low quality of designs out there in random, more of the low or middle end of fashion, as opposed to the high end, where I think they still keep traditional methods of creation and couture. But I find that, for example, the analog is always the best way to begin a design process, and then taking it to the computer later. Because oftentimes, for example, in terms of the weaving classes, trying to teach weaving without looms is, especially now in the remote setting, has been particularly challenging because there's something that you see on the computer screen, but you really have no idea of how it's going to look in the physical world. And I think the same happens with Photoshop, graphic design. A lot of times we create things on the computer, but then when it's printed, it looks entirely different. So I find that the other way is much better, starting from the art, from the hands-on craft or painting, and then taking it to the computer later with an understanding of what the physical object will be. And these days of so much digital and so many images that are shared through online, I find that it's very easy to forget that sheet of paper, graph paper, or things that were done 100 years ago, and the value of the time that it takes to really slowly design, create something that is a lot more special than something that, for example, is done with a few clicks of the mouse.
I love the variety on, I love the variety on these answers. Thank you so much. Why don't we move to the fourth question, and then maybe we can come back to the issue that Natasha raised about working sort of in the interstices of the art world or around current practices, either art world, fashion world, etc. And I know Kyung Hee has a question, and there may be other questions in the chat that will develop. So the fourth question that I had for you is, can you address the particular challenges or realities within your industry for women, for people of color, for queers? How has Black Lives Matter, Oscars So White, Me Too, all the social movements that are taking place right now, shaping what it means to work in your industry? And, there was a really rich conversation in the last panel about social movements and collective solidarity and also racial capitalism. So I just kind of want to bring in how social movements, both what do you perceive the status of different individuals or groups of individuals within your industries, and then what kind of pushback has there been? How has it changed in the last 5 years, let's say? Should I pick someone?
I can start us off and just talk more specifically about the art world and how I see this operating within it. One thing I would say is that the art world historically has probably been one of the most, and maybe particularly the art market, which is something I focus on, one of the most racially and socioeconomically homogenous industries. Certainly, I think that continues to be true. And that's one thing that's so interesting about running a course like the course that I lead at F.I.T, which, as part of the State University of New York, I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us potentially to be a kind of agent of diversity in this field that is not very diverse, at least as of now. And I would say that the art world has responded, very much so to these social movements. But, you could definitely say that a lot of it is virtual signaling or lip service. And, there definitely are some examples, though, I think, of substantive gestures, substantive change, or, institutions really rethinking hiring practices. For instance, the gallerist David Warner hired the curator Ebony Haynes to run a new gallery in New York that will have an all-Black staff. So that's just one example of a gallery that sort of represents the most sort of elite echelon of the art market, which of course is a very white sort of segment of the market, and trying to diversify and to open itself up to new voices, new perspectives. I'd also say that we see, certainly among art museums, a lot of movement. And I think there are some really important questions about what this will ultimately result in, especially in a place like the United States where museums are so dependent on private philanthropy. But certainly in terms of hiring, I think there is a new commitment to diversifying. And I think in terms of programming as well, we're seeing this. And in terms of acquisitions, I'm personally excited about MoMA's having an upcoming show about the Black Run gallery just above Midtown, which is a kind of historical pioneering gallery that certainly hasn't gotten its due. And I think museums and institutions are interested in, again, sort of expanding the narrative to be more inclusive and to showcase artists and other figures that were maybe overlooked in their day, but were contributing really historically important either artworks or, in this case, a kind of cultural conversation around art. So, I mean, I would say that yeah, that there still are a lot of challenges, though, and maybe I'll end on that somewhat dismal note that, even though, like, I think Daniel was mentioning about many FIT students being female, many of our students are female, and yet you look at who are running institutions, who are running major commercial galleries or auction houses, and it definitely tends to look very different than the population that's entering these fields. And I think that remains a challenge in addition to other forms of diversity, racial, sexual orientation, all of it. So I would say there is definitely a lot of movement, but there are still the kind of hangover effect of a very, in some ways, homogenous and conservative culture that, especially in a field like the art market, which is so dependent on the socioeconomic kind of very elite, it remains a challenge.
Thanks. Does someone else want to take that question up?
Yeah, what I've seen for the most part has been very inspiring. Seeing all these social movements give us a new understanding and forcing us to think about things that were perhaps hard topics. What I've seen also is better quality of the arts in galleries and magazines. For example, when they give the opportunity to people who have been overlooked, perhaps, but who have been making art that has all along been very powerful. For example, Black artists today. I'm talking about artists like Titus Kaphar, Mark Bradford, Kara Walker, Hope L, and Sam Gilliam, who recently had his first solo exhibition in New York City, even though he's been one of the most important artists in America lately. So it's interesting to see that when we are more inclusive, everything becomes much better. And at the same time, it's inspiring for artists like myself who don't perhaps engage in politics directly or identity, because it really it's a lesson on how the art becomes more important or more interesting when you actually talk about who you are and approach it from a more personal and perhaps autobiographical or revealing aspects of your life that maybe you prefer to keep private or maybe you don't want to deal with. So that's what I've learned personally.
Oops. Thanks. Natalie, do you want to add anything? It seems like the fashion world has really been thrown up with fashion photography and Vogue and, you know, what's going on in the magazines and modeling.
Absolutely. The
There's
last
so much.
Absolutely. And you know what? I also think, again, back to this commercialization, I teach a contemporary global fashion class. It's my first time teaching it this semester. I wrote the class, and I think I really approach also labor and sort of broader historical movements throughout that class. And we spend a lot of time talking about neoliberalism. And when we talk about fashion and social movements and the deployment of these images of protest in a fashion sort of selling, marketing sort of transaction, I use those examples to sort of encourage the students to not look at these things as, oh, it's so great that like Nike supports Colin Kaepernick. Obviously we like Colin Kaepernick. It's great that Nike supports what the protest that he did and that is ongoing. But ultimately, like, why is Nike doing this, right? Why are these massive corporations that arguably exploit workers in other parts of the world, piggybacking on a major visible, person in America who is actively, in this protest? And the idea is not to talk about as if being good or bad, right? It's problematizing it. And I think that this is something that I reiterate to my students over and over again. And I think in fashion, it's really interesting because I think, in my perspective, fashion very often is like the zeitgeist of what's happening, right? If you think about fashion in 2020, you're only going to think about sweatpants and masks. That's really what it's going to be. But when you think about fashion today and you think about all of the social movements that are happening, I think an important way to lead students to breaking it down is sort of thinking about how, obviously in these discussions of cultural appropriation and all of these ideas, it's really important to break this down in this commercial sort of setting. And I think that social media and outlets like Diet Prada and other sort of, what you could call, grassroots people who are calling out in public these instances help drive this conversation. So I think in the case of fashion, it's really important because, yes, we see so much more representation, so much more diversity, so much more support of designers from other parts of the world that have been traditionally excluded from, like European fashion with a capital F. But the reality is that if you could go back to the Silk Road, all clothing cultures are sort of hybrid examples of technique and aesthetic. And so I think just giving students the tools to learn about these things and break them down and understand how they could be co-opted or used authentically is really, in my opinion, like what I could offer them in terms of how they could, grapple with these ideas.
Thanks so much. These are great answers, and we have only 7 minutes to go. So I think what I'd like to do is there's 2 questions in the chat, and maybe look at those, and then if we have time to return to the issue that Natasha raised. I mean, I was also really taken with the whole issue that you raised, Ruben, about health and safety, which we've talked about virtually not at all, and which is also really critical, it seems to me, both in the art industry and in the fashion industry. Okay, so Kyung Hee's question, which is in the chat, is for Natasha. What would be an impact of participatory art? So this is good. This brings us back to what you raised earlier. Beeple's digital art collage of all the images that the artists known as Beeple have been posting since 2007 was sold for $69 million. Blockchain certified digital files versus video art files. Is this a more efficient way of working as an artist? Almost like a licensing agreement of printed images or copyright protected design pieces?
Yeah, well, this is the big topic of conversation at the moment. I feel like every year there's some sort of like art market stunt, whether it's the Banksy shredded painting or now the Beeple sale, which I think everybody was just kind of aghast at, selling for $69 million. And so, clearly right now, the big topic within the art world and within the culture at large, I guess, is NFTs. Saturday Night Live even did a skit about NFTs. If you didn't see that, you should check it out. So yeah, I think this is a great question, and actually maybe a way to sort of tie in also this idea of alternative ways of operating within either the art or fashion world, because NFTs now are a way to commodify labor in a lot of different ways. So you see artists making NFTs, which, I mean, I would say, just to clarify, like, I see NFTs as both new technology and also a very old idea. It's kind of like the equivalent of a certificate of authenticity, but just using blockchain technology. So it's, you know, the idea that this is going to like revolutionize the art world, I'm not so sure about that, but it certainly is changing things in the short term right now. A lot of galleries are there's going to be an NFT art fair coming up. A lot of galleries are looking at NFTs now as a way to expand their business. So, you know, I think the Beeple thing does point to the fact that there is, in my view, change on the horizon. And I think a lot of creative practitioners are looking at ways to break out of the traditional, you know, within the art world, maybe the representation model where artists typically work with galleries. But there's a lot of ways now that I think artists are navigating their careers and looking beyond that. And I think that, you know, on one hand, we've seen certain galleries become much more prominent and powerful and, you know, grow their premises and grow their artist rosters and become more profitable. But a lot of other galleries, especially during COVID, have either shut their doors or are struggling. And I think also there's more and more artists, many of whom are not being well served by this model. And so all of these factors, I think, are contributing to artists looking beyond the traditional, and that could be different forms of freelance work, different forms of working with, you know, corporations. You've seen a huge, and I'm interested, Natalie, in hearing your thoughts on the artist brand collaborations, which have totally taken off in recent years. But, you know, I think also NFTs point to the fact that people are looking to digital technology as a way of getting their work out there and even to transact their work. So, you know, we've seen a lot of activity on Instagram and social media. And that's predating this whole NFT thing where artists were selling their work directly to collectors, bypassing galleries. Some artists have very robust markets just doing that and not going through traditional institutions at all. And then you have like the Beeple thing, which is, you know, I forget exactly what the number was, but prior to that sale, the highest price he had sold a work for was like $10,000. So, I mean, that's a very unique phenomenon. And I've read just a little bit about the people who bought the Beeple work, and I think that was a very unusual and probably a situation that's not likely to be replicated again as much as another art would love for it to become the norm. I doubt that we're going to see that, but you know, I do think that digital technologies has unleashed this potential for you know, both creating markets, obviously creating work as well. Although I would say with the NFT in particular, there are a lot of questions about like the legal status of NFTs. You can make an NFT not just based on your own work, but based on someone else's work, and people are doing that now, which raises a lot of questions. So I don't know that this is going to like totally transform or replace the art market as it exists, but I think we're definitely going to be seeing more and more movement in that direction.
Thanks. I was going to ask for other folks' input, but we actually have 1 minute left.
No, Carol, you can go a little bit longer if you want. It's okay.
Okay, so then I'm going to read Marge Crumb's comment and see if Natalie and Ruben want to add any other final thoughts, or Natasha as well. So Marge wrote, "The White Boys of New York, her moniker for the Mad Men days, are still so prominent. We're getting closer to be included, but seats at the table are still difficult to obtain." So that's her comment more than a question, I think. So if you want to add any final thoughts, respond to what Natasha said, it'd be great to hear your final ideas.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that I've been reading a book about Latinx artists, and it just expresses how difficult it is to market these type of artists, or to explain what it actually means. For some Latinos, Latinx doesn't seem to be a term that they identify or we identify with so much. And at the same time, there seems to be a specific group of people that this term seems to be really clear to explain who they are. For example, when we speak about Latinx, we speak about people of Latin origin who live in the United States, some of which have been born in the United States, and some of which have been basically consider themselves Americans, but also have a strong identity from the place of origin. And this has become a very difficult point for many galleries and museums to market or explain, and therefore has been a very unrepresented group of people. The book opens with the example of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who is super famous and has been selling for a lot of money. And it explains that he was actually Latinx in the definition because he was from Haitian origin and the Dominican mother. So, but that's not how we see Jean-Michel Basquiat. And it happens with many other artists. In my case, I identify with Latinx because I was born in the United States, but I grew up in Caracas. So my mother is Venezuelan, my father is Guatemalan, but so it's very confusing. Where am I from? And it's very difficult to explain that to a potential collector or to a gallery. So I guess that would be my input in terms of Marge comment.
Thanks, Ruben. Natalie, do you want to add a final comment?
Well, I think briefly, I think that in terms of labor and fashion, and I think to answer your question, Natasha, about collaborations with artists, the thing is, this is not even that it's such an old idea, right? You could go back to like Pisanello drawing textile patterns, but I think that the collaborations and the increased customization and all of those elements of it just create more and more cachet, and I think it just allows consumers to identify literally by wearing things made by artists, those ideas on their bodies, but then also engage with, the broader sort of public in that. Yeah, that's what I have to say. And I would love to engage more with all of you. This was such a wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Carol, for chairing this.
Yeah, thank you. Each different perspective was really valuable and added so much to kind of the contours of the larger conversation. I'm really appreciative. Oh, Ruben, you put the book title down because people were asking for it. Do you mind telling us what it is, since we're going off?
I'm sorry, about the book?
Yeah, the title.
Yes, it's Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and Politics by Arlene Davila.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Again, thank you, panelists. Daniel and Kyung-hee, this was really a great panel, and I loved the last one, so I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day. Thank you for organizing this.
Thanks, Carol. So just a logistical issue. One, we're coming back in a little less than half an hour at 12 o'clock for art and design in the age of catastrophe. But if anybody would like to join me and some of my students, we're all going to go to the Midtown room right now. Students, come with me. And what I'd like to talk about, I think that it was Natasha who mentioned this. Did you say that it's David Zwerner who's funding a new gallery where all the employees are going to be African American?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So I want to go to Midtown and talk about the implications of having a gallery that's just run and staffed by Black people. So join us in Midtown if you'd like, or come see us in 25 minutes. Thanks, everybody.